The air inside the old cathedral felt heavy, as if the weight of 100 years of whispered prayers and broken promises had settled into the stone walls. I, Charlotte Lottie Bennett, stood at the altar, my white wedding gown clinging to my skin like a second layer of regret. The dress was beautiful, ivory silk with delicate lace that trailed behind me like a ghost, but I didn't want to wear it. I didn't want to be here at all. The stained glass windows above cast fractured beams of red, blue, and gold across the pews, painting the faces of the sparse congregation in a kaleidoscope of colors. But no amount of light could warm the cold dread that coiled in my chest. Was 35 years old, a successful lawyer who had spent the last decade building a life in New York, far away from the family I'd left behind. And now, here I was, standing in this ancient cathedral, about to marry a man I barely knew. Edward Harrington, a 48-year-old tech billionaire, stood beside me, his presence as imposing as the cathedral itself. His gray eyes were sharp, unreadable, and his face was a mask of cold indifference as he slipped the platinum band onto my finger. I felt nothing, no spark, no warmth, just the icy realization that this was a transaction, not a marriage. Edward would pay off the crushing debt that had buried my family after my brother's death, and in return, I would be his wife, a polished accessory to hide a secret I didn't yet know. I glanced at the front pew, where my mother, Margaret, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. At 62, she still carried herself with the quiet strength that had held our family together through every storm, but her eyes betrayed her. Hope mingled with a deep, unspoken pain. Beside her, my father, Henry, a retired judge at 65, gripped her hand. His shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own shame pressed down on him. I knew why they were here, why they had pushed me into this. My brother Daniel had died in a car accident 10 years ago, leaving behind a mountain of debt from a failed business venture. I wasn't there when it happened. I was in New York, chasing my career, too busy to come home, too selfish to see the cracks forming in my family. By the time I returned, Daniel was gone, and my parents were drowning in grief and financial ruin. This marriage was their lifeline, and I was the price. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown, my fingers brushing against the small silver pendant that had once belonged to Daniel. It was a simple thing, a tiny star on a thin chain, but it held the weight of 1,000 memories. I pressed it against my palm, the cool metal grounding me as I fought the urge to run. I could still hear Daniel's laugh, the way he'd tease me for being too serious, too driven. "Live a little, Lottie," he'd say, his voice echoing in my mind. But I hadn't lived. Not for him, not for my parents. I'd chosen my career over them, and now I was paying for it in a way I never imagined. The priest's voice droned on, his words a distant hum as I stole another glance at Edward. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and a jawline that could cut glass. His tailored black tuxedo fit him perfectly, a testament to the wealth and power that defined him. But there was no warmth in him, no hint of the man I might one day love. "I don't need you, Edward," I thought, the words a silent rebellion in my mind. But I needed to save my family, and that was the only thing keeping me here. My eyes drifted to my father again, and I saw the way he bowed his head, as if he couldn't bear to meet my gaze. I knew he felt responsible for this. His own mistakes, as a judge, had left him vulnerable, his reputation tarnished by whispers of corruption that he'd never fully shaken. He had begged me to do this, his voice trembling as he said, "You're our only hope, Lottie." I couldn't say no, not when I'd already failed them so many times before. I stepped closer to my mother before the ceremony had begun, my hands trembling as I adjusted the soft shawl around her shoulders. Her fingers were cold, her skin paper thin, and I felt a pang of guilt for all the years I'd been absent. "You look beautiful, darling," she'd whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. But I couldn't respond. I didn't feel beautiful. I felt like a fraud, a pawn in a game I didn't understand. My father had looked away, his eyes fixed on the floor, and I knew he was hiding his shame, the same shame that had driven us to this moment. The priest's voice snapped me back to the present. Do you, Charlotte Bennett, take Edward Harrington to be your lawfully wedded husband? I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I wanted to scream, to tear off this dress and run out into the rain-soaked streets of New York. But I couldn't. I couldn't abandon my family again. I do, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the words tasting like ash on my tongue. Edward's hand was steady as he slid the ring onto my finger, but his touch was cold, clinical. He didn't look at me, didn't smile, didn't offer any sign that this meant anything to him. I was nothing more than a contract, a means to an end. And yet, as I stood there, the pendant in my hand and my parents' eyes on me, I felt a flicker of something else. Resolve, maybe, or defiance. I didn't belong here, in this cathedral, in this marriage, in this life. But I would endure it. I would save my family, even if it meant sacrificing myself. The organ began to play, a haunting melody that filled the cathedral as we turned to face the congregation. I caught my mother's eye, and for a moment, I saw a glimmer of gratitude, a silent thank you that broke my heart. But my father's gaze was still averted, his shame a wall between us. I looked at Edward, his profile sharp and unyielding, and I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't need him, but I needed to survive him, and somehow, I would. The city of New York glittered below like a constellation of fallen stars, its light stretching endlessly into the night. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Edward Harrington's penthouse, my reflection a ghostly silhouette against the glass. The space around me was a monument to wealth, polished marble floors, modern art on the walls, and a sleek minimalist design that screamed money, but whispered nothing of warmth. I was still in my wedding gown, the ivory silk now feeling like a shroud, heavy with the weight of the day. My fingers clutched a glass of red wine, the deep burgundy liquid untouched, my knuckles white from the tension I couldn't release. Edward had brought me here after the ceremony, a silent drive through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan in his black Rolls-Royce. He hadn't spoken a word, his hand steady on the wheel, his gray eyes fixed on the road ahead. I hadn't spoken either. I didn't trust myself to. What could I say to a man I'd just married, a man I didn't know, a man who saw me as nothing more than a clause in a contract? The penthouse was his domain, a fortress of glass and steel high above the city, and I felt like an intruder, a stranger in a life I hadn't chosen. I turned away from the window, my gaze falling on Edward. He stood by the fireplace, the flames, casting flickering shadows across his sharp features. His salt and pepper hair caught the light, and his gray eyes, cold as slate, watched me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He'd shed his tuxedo jacket, the white dress shirt beneath rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle. He looked every bit the billionaire he was, powerful, untouchable, and utterly unreadable. "You don't need to pretend to love me, Lottie," he said, his voice low and measured, each word precise as a blade. "This is just a deal." His words hit me like a slap, though I'd known they were coming. I'd felt the truth of them in the cathedral, in the way he'd slipped the ring onto my finger with clinical precision, in the way he'd avoided my gaze during the entire ceremony. But hearing him say it out loud, so bluntly, ignited a spark of anger in me. I set the wine glass down on the glass coffee table with a deliberate clink, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "I'm not pretending anything," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I'm here because I have to be, that's all." He didn't respond, just watched me, his expression unchanging. I hated how composed he was, how he seemed to see right through me while giving nothing of himself in return. I turned away, unable to bear his scrutiny, and walked to the corner of the room where my suitcase sat, a small piece of my old life in this sterile new world. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling as I unzipped the bag. Inside, nestled among my clothes, was the small silver pendant that had belonged to my brother, Daniel. I pulled it out, the star-shaped charm catching the light as I held it to my chest. The metal was cool against my skin, but it burned with memories. I closed my eyes, and I was back in our childhood home in upstate New York, the scent of pine and my mother's cooking filling the air. Daniel was there, his laughter echoing, as he chased me through the backyard, the pendant swinging from his neck. "You're too serious, Lottie," he'd teased, his voice warm with affection. "Live a little." But I hadn't listened. I'd been too focused on my dreams, on becoming a lawyer, on escaping the small-town life that felt like a cage. I'd left for New York, chasing success, and I hadn't been there when Daniel needed me most. He'd died in that car accident 10 years ago, and I hadn't even made it to his funeral. I'd been in court, arguing a case, too busy to answer my mother's calls. By the time I got the news, he was already gone. A tear slipped down my cheek, and I wiped it away quickly, hoping Edward hadn't seen. But when I looked up, he was still watching me, his expression unreadable. I stood, the pendant still in my hand, and walked back to the window, needing the distance between us. The city stretched out below, a sea of lights that felt as cold and distant as the man behind me. I thought of my parents, of the way my mother's hands had trembled when I'd adjusted her shawl in the cathedral, of the way my father had looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I'd failed them, just as I'd failed Daniel. And now, I was here, in this penthouse, married to a man who didn't want me, all because I couldn't bear to fail them again. "Why did you agree to this?" I asked suddenly, my voice cutting through the silence. I turned to face Edward, the pendant still clutched in my hand. "You could have anyone. Why me?" He didn't answer right away, just took a sip of the whiskey he'd poured himself, the ice clinking softly in the glass. "Because you were the right choice," he said finally, his tone as cold as the drink in his hand. "You're smart, discreet, and you needed something I could provide. It's that simple." His words stung, but they weren't unexpected. I'd known this was a transaction, a deal struck in boardrooms and backrooms, not a love story. But hearing him reduce me to a strategic decision made my chest ache with a loneliness I hadn't felt in years. I turned back to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass, the pendant a heavy weight in my hand. "Can I ever make this right?" I whispered to myself. The question meant for Daniel, for my parents, for the life I'd left behind. The city didn't answer, and neither did Edward. The fire crackled in the background, the only sound in the vast, empty penthouse. I stood there, alone in my wedding gown, staring out at a world that felt as unreachable as the happiness I'd once known. I didn't know if I could redeem myself, if I could heal the wounds I'd inflicted on my family. But I knew I had to try, even if it meant surviving this marriage, this man, this life. The ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria shimmered under the glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, their light reflecting off the polished marble floors and the glittering gowns of New York's elite. I stood at the edge of the crowd, a glass of champagne in my hand, the bubbles rising like tiny prayers I didn't have the faith to utter. I was dressed in a sleek black gown, its elegant lines hugging my frame, a stark contrast to the white wedding dress I'd worn just 2 weeks ago. But the weight of that day still clung to me, heavier than the diamond necklace Edward had insisted I wear tonight. This was our first public appearance as a married couple, a charity gala for a children's hospital, and I was playing the part of the perfect wife, poised, polished, and utterly hollow inside. Edward stood beside me, his presence a quiet storm, in the room. He was impeccable in a tailored black tuxedo, His salt and pepper hair swept back, his gray eyes scanning the crowd with the precision of a predator. He hadn't spoken much since we'd arrived, but his hand rested lightly on the small of my back, a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "You need to behave appropriately, Lottie," he'd whispered as we entered, his voice low and edged with steel. "Don't embarrass me." I'd nodded, my jaw tight, but inside, I was seething. I wasn't a child to be scolded, nor a trophy to be displayed. But I knew why he was so tense. His business partners were here, their eyes sharp and calculating, whispering about the suddenness of our marriage. Edward needed to prove that this union was real, that I was more than a contract, even if we both knew the truth. I took a sip of champagne, the crisp taste doing little to ease the knot in my chest. The room buzzed with conversation, the clink of glasses, and the soft strains of a string quartet. But I felt detached, as if I were watching the scene through a pane of glass. My mind kept drifting back to the cathedral, to the cold weight of Edward's ring on my finger, to the pendant I'd held that night in the penthouse. I'd left my family behind to chase my career, and now I was here, playing a role I didn't want, all to save them from the ruin I'd helped create. The irony was bitter, and it tasted worse than the champagne. A familiar figure caught my eye across the room, and my heart clenched. My father, Henry, stood near a table adorned with white roses, his gray suit slightly rumpled, his posture stooped with the weight of years and regret. At 65, he looked older than I remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes shadowed with a guilt I knew too well. He'd been a judge, a man of honor, but whispers of corruption had followed him into retirement, tainting his legacy. I knew he blamed himself for our family's financial ruin, for the debt that had spiraled after Daniel's death. I walked toward him, my heels clicking softly against the marble, and when I reached him, I knelt slightly to adjust his tie, my fingers brushing against the worn fabric. "You didn't have to come, Dad," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. His hands caught mine, his grip surprisingly strong, and when he looked at me, his eyes were wet with unshed tears. "I had to, Lottie," he said, his voice trembling. "You're doing this for me, for us. I'm so sorry." His words cut through me, sharp and raw, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that I didn't blame him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I squeezed his hand, offering a small smile that felt more like a grimace, and turned away before he could see the tears threatening to spill. I returned to Edward's side, but the air between us was thick with tension. The crowd parted as a group of his business partners approached, their smiles as sharp as their tailored suits. I forced a smile, nodding politely as they made small talk, but I could feel Edward's eyes on me, watching, judging. When the group moved on, he leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear. "You're doing well," he said, but there was no warmth in his tone, only a cold approval that made my skin crawl. "Keep it up." I pulled back, my eyes narrowing as I met his gaze. "I'm not your puppet, Edward," I snapped, my voice low but laced with venom. "I'm here because I have to be, not because I want to be your perfect little wife." His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking in his cheek, but his expression remained unreadable. "I'm doing this to protect you, Lottie," he said, his voice a low growl. "You don't understand the stakes." I wanted to argue, to demand he explain himself, but the words died on my lips as I saw my mother, Margaret, standing near. The edge of the room. She was watching us, her face a mask of quiet observation, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I knew she'd seen the exchange, and I wondered what she thought of this marriage. Of me. Did she see the daughter who'd abandoned her, or the one who was trying to make things right? I couldn't bear to meet her gaze, So I turned back to Edward, my voice cold. "I understand more than you think," I said. "But I'm not here to make you look good. I'm here for my family." He didn't respond, but the tension between us crackled like a live wire. I took another sip of champagne, the glass trembling slightly in my hand, and let my eyes wander over the crowd. I was fighting a battle on two fronts. Against Edward, who saw me as a means to an end, and against myself, against the guilt that gnawed at me with every breath. I wanted to be free, to walk away from this charade. But I couldn't. Not when my parents' future depended on me. Not when I'd already failed them so spectacularly. The string quartet struck up a new melody, and the crowd began to move toward the dance floor. Edward extended his hand, his expression still unreadable. "Dance with me," he said, more a command than a request. I hesitated, then placed my hand in his, feeling the cold metal of his wedding band against my skin. As we moved to the center of the floor, the chandeliers above casting their light over us, I felt the weight of every eye in the room. I was Charlotte Bennett, the lawyer who'd sold her freedom for her family's survival. And I had no idea how to escape the cage I'd locked myself in. The penthouse was silent, save for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls. It was late, well past midnight, and the weight of the charity gala still lingered in my bones. I couldn't sleep, my mind a tangled mess of guilt, anger, and questions I didn't have the courage to ask. Edward had retreated to his bedroom after our dance, his parting words a curt, "Good night, Lottie," that felt more like a dismissal than a farewell. I'd stood there in the ballroom, watching him walk away, the chandeliers above casting their light on the empty space he left behind. Now, alone in the vast expanse of his penthouse, I felt like a ghost haunting a life that wasn't mine. I needed answers. Edward's coldness, his cryptic words at the gala. "I'm doing this to protect you, Lottie," gnawed at me like a splinter I couldn't pull free. Who was he protecting me from? And why did he care? I'd seen the way. He looked at me, as if I were a puzzle he couldn't solve, a piece of a game he was playing alone. I couldn't keep living in the dark, not when every moment in this marriage felt like a step closer to losing myself entirely. So I did something I knew I shouldn't. I slipped into his study, the one room in the penthouse he'd told me was off limits. The study was a stark contrast to the rest of the penthouse. Where the living areas were all glass and steel, this room was warm, almost intimate, with dark wooden bookshelves lining the walls and a faint scent of ink and leather in the air. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with papers, a laptop, and a single framed photo I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, but the need to know outweighed my fear. I moved behind the desk, my fingers brushing against the smooth wood, and opened the top drawer. Inside, nestled among a stack of files, was a small photograph and a folded letter. The photo was faded at the edges, but the image was clear. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, with dark hair and gray eyes that mirrored Edward's. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around a teddy bear, and something about her expression tugged at my heart. I turned the photo over, and there, in Edward's precise handwriting, was a name: Sophie. My breath caught in my throat as I unfolded the letter, the paper crinkling softly in my trembling hands. It was addressed to someone named Emily, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Emily, I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you needed me to be. I'm sorry I couldn't be the father Sophie deserved. I wasn't brave enough to claim her, to face the world with the truth. I thought I was protecting her, but I know now I was only protecting myself. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to make this right, but I need you to know I've never stopped loving her. Or you." Edward. I stared at the letter, my mind reeling. Edward had a daughter, A daughter he'd never acknowledged. A daughter he'd kept hidden from the world. The realization sent a shiver down my spine, not because of the secret itself, but because of the raw vulnerability in his words. This wasn't the cold, calculating man I'd married. This was a man haunted by regret, a man who'd made choices he couldn't undo. And in that moment, I saw myself in him. I thought of the letter I'd written to Daniel, the one I'd never sent, the one where I'd poured out my guilt for not being there when he needed me. I'd kept it in a drawer in my old apartment, a confession I couldn't bear to share, just as Edward had kept this letter hidden away. I clutched the photo to my chest, my fingers trembling as memories of Daniel flooded back. I remembered the last photo I'd taken with him, a Polaroid from a summer picnic, the two of us laughing under a willow tree. I'd lost that photo years ago during one of my many moves, and the loss had felt like losing him all over again. Now, holding Sophie's picture, I felt a strange kinship with Edward, a shared language of regret, of things left unsaid, of love buried under the weight of our mistakes. The door creaked open behind me and I froze, the letter still in my hand. Edward stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light from the hallway. His gray eyes narrowed, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of something raw in his expression. Anger, yes, but also fear. "You have no right to be in here," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a shard of ice. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room, and I felt the air grow heavy with tension. "And you have no right to hide this from me," I shot back, my voice trembling but firm. I held up the letter, the photo still clutched in my other hand. "You have a daughter, Edward, a daughter you've never even mentioned. Why didn't you tell me?" He stopped, his jaw tightening, and, for a moment, I thought he might turn and walk away. But then he spoke, his voice quieter now, laced with a pain I hadn't expected. "Because I didn't want you to see me as a failure," he said, his eyes locked on mine. "I didn't want you to know the man I really am." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't name, pity, perhaps, or understanding. I looked down at the photo of Sophie, her gray eyes so much like her father's, and I thought of Daniel, of the family I'd failed, of the guilt that had driven me to this marriage. "We're not so different, you and I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're both running from our pasts." Edward didn't respond, but the silence between us spoke volumes. I placed the photo and letter back in the drawer, my hands shaking, and left the study without another word. As I walked back to my room, the pendant in my pocket felt heavier than ever, a reminder of the brother I'd lost, and the family I still had a chance to save. But now, I carried another weight, the knowledge of Edward's secret, and the question that burned in my mind. Could I help him face his past? Or would I be consumed by my own? The rain came down in sheets, a relentless curtain of water that blurred the lights of Manhattan into a hazy glow. I sat in the passenger seat of Edward's Rolls-Royce, the leather cool against my skin, my black gown from the charity gala still, clinging to me like a second skin. The car was a cocoon of silence, save for the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the occasional crackle of thunder in the distance. Edward's hands were steady on the wheel, his gray eyes fixed on the road ahead, but I could feel the tension radiating from him, a storm as fierce as the one outside. We hadn't spoken since we'd left the gala, but the air between us was heavy with unspoken words, the weight of the secret I'd uncovered in his study pressing down on us both. I'd barely had time to process the revelation of Edward's daughter Sophie when the news broke. My phone buzzed incessantly in my lap, notifications piling up like a digital avalanche. I glanced at the screen, my heart sinking as I saw the headline from the Wall Street Journal. Billionaire Edward. Harrington's marriage a sham, a secret child revealed. The article was brutal, detailing our marriage as a calculated deal to cover up Edward's past, a past that included a daughter he'd never acknowledged. The comments online were even worse, a vicious swarm of strangers calling me a gold digger, a fraud, a woman who'd sold her soul for money. "She's just a pawn in his game," one commenter wrote. "Pathetic," said another. I turned the phone face down, my hands trembling, but the words burned into my mind. Edward's phone buzzed too, and I saw his jaw tighten as he glanced at the screen. "It's already affecting the company," he said, his voice low and clipped. "3 partners have pulled out of the merger. They don't trust me anymore." He didn't look at me, but I could hear the accusation in his tone, as if I were somehow to blame for this. I wanted to snap back, to remind him that I hadn't asked for any of this, but the words caught in my throat. The truth was, I felt responsible, not for the leak, but for the mess I'd become a part of. I'd agreed to this marriage to save my family, but now I was drowning in the fallout, and I didn't know how to swim to shore. The car slowed as we pulled into a quiet side street, the rain hammering against the roof like 1,000 tiny fists. Edward turned off the engine, but he didn't move, his hand still gripping the wheel. I couldn't take the silence anymore. "Why didn't you tell me about her?" I asked, my voice breaking the stillness like a stone through glass. "About Sophie? If I'd known, I could have..." "Could have what, Lottie?" he interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut. He turned to face me, his gray eyes blazing with a mix of anger and something deeper, something raw. "Prepared for this? Protected me? You think you could have stopped this from happening?" He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to see me as a failure. I didn't want you to know the man I really am." His words echoed the ones he'd spoken in the study, but they hit harder now, under the weight of the public's judgment. I saw the pain in his eyes, the same pain I'd felt when I'd held Sophie's photo, the same pain I carried for Daniel. "You're not a failure, Edward," I said softly, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. "You made a mistake. We all do. But you can't keep running from it." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time since we'd met, I saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of vulnerability that made him seem almost human. But before he could respond, his phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the moment. He answered it, his expression darkening as he listened. "James," he said, his voice a low growl. "What do you want?" I froze at the name. James Carver, Edward's former business partner, a man who'd betrayed him years ago, nearly destroying his company in a ruthless takeover bid. I'd heard the stories from Edward's associates, whispered tales of a friendship, turned sour, of a man who'd stop at nothing to see Edward fall. And now, he was back. I couldn't hear James's side of the conversation, but Edward's face told me everything I needed to know. "You'll regret this," Edward said, his voice cold as ice, before hanging up. He turned to me, his expression grim. "He's the one who leaked the story. And he's not done. He says he has more. Enough to ruin me completely if I don't pull out of the merger." The weight of his words settled over me like a lead blanket. James Carver wasn't just a threat to Edward. He was a threat to my family, to the fragile hope I'd clung to when I'd agreed to this marriage. If Edward's company collapsed, the deal to save my parents would fall apart, and they'd lose everything. I couldn't let that happen. Not after everything I'd already sacrificed. I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched Edward's arm, the fabric of his suit damp from the rain. "We'll face this together," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "He won't win." Edward looked at my hand on his arm, then up at me, his gray eyes searching mine. For a moment, I thought he might pull away, retreat back into the cold shell I'd come to expect. But instead, he nodded. A small, almost imperceptible gesture that felt like a lifeline in the storm. I pulled my hand back, my fingers brushing against his cheek as I did, and I wiped away a stray drop of rain that had clung to his skin. The gesture was small, intimate, and it reminded me of a moment long ago, wiping tears from Daniel's face after he'd fallen off his bike, his laughter breaking through the pain. I blinked back the memory, my chest aching with the weight of it. The rain continued to fall, a steady drumbeat against the car. But inside, something had shifted. Edward and I were still strangers, bound by a contract and a shared enemy. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of connection, a fragile thread of understanding woven through our mutual pain. I didn't know if it would be enough to save us, but it was enough to keep me fighting. For my family, for Edward, for the chance to make things right. I turned to look out the window, the city lights blurred by the rain, and I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let James Carver destroy us. Not now. Not ever. The small town of Hudson, New York, felt like a world away from the glittering chaos of Manhattan. The air here was crisp, scented with pine and the faint tang of the river, and the streets were lined with quaint shops and houses that seemed frozen in time. I stood on the porch of a modest 2-story home, my heart pounding as Edward knocked on the door. We'd driven up this morning, a tense 3-hour journey after our rain-soaked confrontation in the car. The decision to find Sophie, Edward's daughter, had been mine, but he'd agreed with a quiet resolve that surprised me. She deserves to know her father, I'd said, and though he hadn't responded, the look in his gray eyes told me he knew I was right. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 30s, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, her face etched with exhaustion. Emily, Sophie's mother, stared at us, her expression shifting from confusion to cold recognition as her gaze landed on Edward. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp, her arms crossing over, her chest like a shield. Behind her, a young girl peeked out. Sophie, I realized. Her gray eyes so much like Edward's, wide with curiosity but shadowed with a wariness that broke my heart. "I need to see her," Edward said, his voice low but steady, though I could hear the tremor beneath it. "I need to make this right." Emily's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward, her voice rising with a fury that had been simmering for years. "You think you can just show up after 12 years and make things, right? You abandoned her, Edward. You abandoned us." Her words were a lash, and I saw Edward flinch, the first real crack I'd seen in his carefully constructed armor. I wanted to reach for him, to offer some kind of comfort, but I held back, knowing this was his battle to fight. Sophie stepped, closer, her small frame dwarfed by the doorway, her dark hair falling in soft waves around her face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, her eyes darting between Edward and me. I knelt down to her level, offering a gentle smile despite the ache in my chest. "I'm Lottie," I said, "and this is your dad." The words felt heavy on my tongue, but they needed to be said. Sophie's eyes widened, and she looked at Edward, searching his face for something. Recognition, maybe, or love. Emily's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "You think you can waltz in here and play father now, after everything?" She turned to me, her gaze piercing. "And you, what are you doing here? You think you can fix this? You don't even know him." Her words stung, but I understood her anger. I wasn't here to fix Edward. I was here to face my own past, to help him face his, to find a way to heal the wounds we'd both inflicted on the people we loved. "I don't know if I can fix anything," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "But I know what it's like to run from your mistakes. I've done it too." And I don't want Sophie to grow up without knowing her father, the way I lost my brother. Emily's expression softened slightly, but before she could respond, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a harsh reminder of the world we'd left behind. I pulled it out, my stomach dropping as I saw the headline, Harrington Scandal Deepens. Judge, Henry Bennett implicated in bribery scheme. James Carver had struck again, this time with a leaked document that claimed my father, a retired judge, had taken bribes to cover up a case years ago. The article included an audio clip, my father's, voice trembling as he admitted to the deal, a moment of weakness that had haunted him ever since. The comments were vicious, tearing into my family's legacy, calling my father a disgrace, a criminal. I felt the blood drain from my face, my knees buckling as I leaned against the porch railing. Edward noticed, his hand reaching for mine, but I pulled away, my mind racing. My father, my proud, honorable father, was crumbling under the weight of this scandal, and I wasn't there to help him. I called my mother, my hands shaking as I pressed the phone to my ear. "Mom, is Dad okay?" I asked, my voice breaking. "He's not well, Lottie," she said, her voice thick with tears. "He collapsed after seeing the news. He's in the hospital now. He blames himself for everything." The guilt in her words mirrored my own, and I felt a sob rise in my throat. I'd failed them again, too caught up in Edward's mess to protect my own family. That night, I faced James Carver at another charity event in Manhattan, a last-minute decision driven by a need to fight back. The ballroom was a sea of glittering, gowns and fake smiles, but I felt none of the glamour as I spotted James across the room, his smirk as sharp as a blade. I marched toward him, my black heels clicking against the marble floor, my eyes blazing with a fury I could no longer contain. "You have no right to destroy my family," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "You've gone too far." James laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You can't protect something that's already rotten, Charlotte," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Your father's a fraud, and Edward's a coward. You're fighting a losing battle." His words were a dagger, but I refused to let him see me break. I turned to the crowd, my heart pounding as I stepped onto the stage, the microphone trembling in my hand. "My family made mistakes," I said, my voice echoing through the room. "My father made a choice he's regretted every day since. But I won't let that define us. I'm here to make things right. For him, for my mother, for the legacy we still have a chance to rebuild." The room was silent, the weight of my confession hanging in the air. But I felt a strange relief, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd carried too long. Later, at the hospital, I sat by my father's bedside, his frail hand in mine. I spooned soup into his mouth, the simple act grounding me in a way nothing else could. "I'm sorry I wasn't there, Dad," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm here now." He squeezed my hand, a silent forgiveness that broke my heart and mended it all at once. I knew the road ahead would be hard, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it, not just for my family, but for myself. The days following my public confession at the charity event felt like a fragile truce, a moment of stillness after the storm. The headlines had shifted, the public's vitriol softening into something closer to empathy as my father's story, his regret, his humanity, came to light. My family's name, the Bennett legacy, was still bruised, but it was no longer bleeding. I'd stood before the world and owned our mistakes, and in doing so, I'd given us a chance to heal. But the wounds within my family, the ones I'd inflicted with my absence, were still raw. And I knew I couldn't stop now. I had to make things right, not just for the public, but for the people who mattered most. I drove to my parents' home in upstate New York, the familiar winding roads a bittersweet reminder of the life I'd left behind. The house was smaller than I remembered, its white paint peeling at the edges, the garden overgrown with weeds. My mother, Margaret, was in the kitchen when I arrived, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough for her famous apple pie. At 62, she still moved with a quiet grace, but I could see the toll the past weeks had taken. The lines around. Her eyes were deeper, her shoulders slumped with a weariness I hadn't noticed before. She looked up as I entered, her face softening into a smile that held both love and pain. "Lottie," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You didn't have to come all this way." I set my bag down, my throat tight with emotion. "I did, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "I've been running from you for too long." I stepped closer, my hands shaking as I knelt before her, the cold tile biting into my knees. "I'm so sorry for leaving you," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "For not being here when Daniel died, for not being the daughter you needed. I thought I was building a life, but I was just running." My mother's hands found mine, her fingers warm and steady, despite the years of hardship they'd endured. She pulled me up, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home. "You're here now, darling," she said, her voice thick with tears. "That's what matters. You've come back to us." Her words broke something inside me, a dam I'd built to hold back the guilt, and I sobbed into her shoulder, the scent of flower and her lavender perfume grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I believed I could be forgiven, not just by her, but by myself. Back in Manhattan, Edward was taking his own steps toward redemption. He'd brought Sophie to the penthouse, a decision that had come after a long, tearful conversation with Emily. I'd watched from the sidelines as he knelt before his daughter, his voice soft but steady as he told her the truth, that he was her father, that he'd made mistakes, that he wanted to be part of her life if she'd let him. Sophie had been quiet at first, her gray eyes, so much like Edward's, searching, his face for something she could trust. But then she'd nodded, a small tentative gesture that felt like a new beginning. Now, Sophie was here, her small suitcase sitting by the door of the penthouse, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. She was a quiet child, her movements careful, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space. I sat on the floor beside her in the living room, a stack of origami paper between us. "Do you know how to make a crane?" I asked, offering her a piece of pale blue paper. She shook her head, her dark hair falling into her eyes, and I smiled, folding the paper with practiced ease. "It's easy," I said, guiding her hands through the steps. "My brother taught me when I was your age. He said if you make 1,000 cranes, your wish will come true." Sophie's eyes lit up, a spark of curiosity breaking through her shyness. "What did you wish for?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. I paused, the memory of Daniel's laughter echoing in my mind. "I wished for him to always be with me," I said, my voice catching. "And, in a way, he is." Sophie smiled, a small, genuine smile that warmed me to my core. And when we finished the crane, she held it up proudly. "You're like a mom," she said, her words so simple yet so profound that I felt tears prick my eyes. I reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and in that moment, I felt a connection I hadn't expected, a chance to be the kind of family I'd failed to be for Daniel. Edward watched us from the doorway, his expression unreadable, but I could see the gratitude in his eyes. Later that night, as Sophie slept in the guest room, we sat by the window, the city lights stretching out before us like a sea of stars. "You gave me the courage to do this, Lottie," he said, his voice low and earnest. to face my past, to be a father to Sophie. I didn't think I could. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who was no longer the cold, untouchable billionaire I'd married. He was flawed, yes, but he was trying, just as I was. "You're stronger than you think, Edward," I said, my voice soft, but firm. "We both are." He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine, and for the first time, I didn't pull away. "I don't need you, Lottie," he said, his gray eyes locked on mine. "But I want you." His words hung in the air, a quiet confession that shifted something between us. I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of the ring on my finger. The ring that had once felt like a shackle, but now felt like a promise. We were still strangers, in so many ways, but we were also two people who'd faced our pasts, who'd chosen to fight for the families we'd nearly lost. I looked out at the city, the lights blurring through the tears in my eyes, and I felt a flicker of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, we could build something real from the ashes of our mistakes. The penthouse glowed with a warmth I'd never thought possible, the kind of warmth that comes not from wealth or luxury, but from the people who fill a space with love. It was a year after the storm that had nearly torn us apart. The scandal, the secrets, the public scrutiny, and we were gathered here, in Edward's once cold sanctuary, for a small celebration. The living room was adorned with soft white lights, their gentle glow reflecting off the glass walls, and a long table was set with my mother's favorite china, the one she'd used for every family gathering I could remember. Tonight wasn't about appearances or deals. It was about us, about the family we'd fought to rebuild. I stood by the window, a glass of sparkling cider in my hand, wearing a simple pale green dress that felt more like me than any of the gowns I'd worn in the past year. The city stretched, out below, a glittering tapestry of lights that no longer felt cold or distant. Edward was beside me, his presence steady and comforting, his hand resting lightly on my waist. He was dressed in a dark sweater and slacks, a far cry from the tailored suits he'd once worn like armor, and his gray eyes held a softness I'd come to cherish. "You've changed this place, Lottie," he said, his voice low and warm, meant just for me. "You've changed me." I turned to him, a smile tugging at my lips as I met his gaze. "We changed each other," I said, my voice soft but certain. And it was true. The man I'd married, the cold billionaire who'd seen me as a contract, was gone. In his place was Edward, a father, a partner, a man who'd learned to love again, just as I had. Across the room, my parents sat on the sofa, their hands intertwined, their faces lit with a quiet joy I hadn't seen in years. My father, Henry, had recovered from his collapse, the hospital stay a distant memory now. At 65, he looked healthier than he had in a long time. His cheeks flushed with color as he laughed at something Sophie said. He'd started telling stories again, tales of his days as a judge, but now they were stories of redemption, of the lessons he'd learned from his mistakes. The public had forgiven him, just as they'd forgiven me, and the Bennett name was no longer a source of shame, but a testament to resilience. My mother, Margaret, caught my eye, and I crossed the room to her, adjusting the soft shawl around her shoulders. Her hands were warm now, no longer trembling, and she smiled up at me, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done so much for us, Lottie," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." I leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead, the scent of her lavender perfume wrapping around me like a hug. "I'm just glad I could make things right," I whispered, my voice catching as I fought back tears. Sophie ran up to me then, her dark hair bouncing as she held up a small origami crane, its pale blue paper crinkled from her eager hands. "Look, Lottie," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "I made it all by myself." I knelt down, taking the crane from her, my heart swelling with a love I hadn't known I was capable of. At 12, Sophie had blossomed in the past year, her shyness giving way to a quiet confidence that reminded me so much of Edward. She'd started calling him Dad, a word that had brought tears to his eyes the first time she'd said it, and she often helped me with small tasks, organizing my legal files, sketching designs for the charity events I now organized. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "You're getting so good at this." Edward joined us, his hand resting on Sophie's shoulder as he looked down at the crane. "She's a quick learner," he said, his voice filled with a pride that made my chest ache. He'd become the father Sophie deserved, the kind of father who showed up, not just with money or gifts, but with time, with love, with the kind of presence I wished I'd given Daniel. I thought of my brother often these days, but the memories no longer hurt as much. They were a reminder of the love we'd shared, a love that lived on in the family I was building now. We sat down to dinner, the table a patchwork of laughter and stories, the kind of gathering I'd dreamed of as a child but had lost along the way. My father raised his glass, his voice steady as he proposed a toast. "To family," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "To second chances." We clinked glasses, the sound a soft melody in the warm room, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek, not from sadness, but from a happiness I'd thought I'd never find. Later, as the evening wound down, Edward and I stood by the window again, the city lights stretching out before us. Sophie was asleep on the couch, her teddy bear tucked under her arm, and my parents were in the guest room, their soft murmurs a comforting hum in the background. Edward turned to me, his hand finding mine, his fingers warm against my skin. "Thank you, Lottie," he said, his voice a quiet confession. "For giving me a family, for giving me a reason to be better." I looked up at him, my heart full in a way I hadn't thought possible. "Thank you, Edward," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "For giving me a home." I leaned into him, my head resting against his chest, and I felt the steady beat of his heart beneath my cheek. It was a rhythm I'd come to know, a rhythm that had once felt foreign but now felt like mine. I thought of the cathedral where we'd married, of the coldness that had defined us then, and I marveled at how far we'd come, not through money or power, but through love, through forgiveness, through the quiet, steady work of rebuilding what we'd broken. The city glittered below, a testament to the life we'd chosen, and I knew, in that moment, that I was exactly where I belonged. I'd lost so much: Daniel, my family's trust, my own sense of self, but I'd found something greater in the ashes, a late-blooming happiness, hard-won, and all the more precious for it. I closed my eyes, Edward's arms around me, and I let myself believe in the future we'd built. One crane, one moment, one heartbeat at a time. If this journey of love, redemption, and family touched your heart, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It means the world to me. And if you want to join me for more stories that inspire and uplift, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep exploring the beauty of second chances together.